thank you for watching. Alright. I'd made videos fairly recently. I didn't wake up this morning thinking I really need to make a video today, but I've got an idea for a video that I don't think I should wait to make. Maybe it'll be useful to you. Maybe it's the Holy Ghost inspiring me. Now, this video idea I have is the start of this video idea. There is a website named Mormonstories. It's mormonstories.org. And as you might guess from the name, they try to talk about, they do interviews with anyone, some more famous than others, that has anything to do with Mormonism. And when I say anything, I mean anything. If their parent is a Mormon, but they don't talk about Mormonism on their YouTube channel. Somebody wants to talk about Mormon. Somebody's met a Mormon. They cover a lot of stuff there. One interview series they did was with an archaeologist or an anthropologist named Michael Coe. And let's see. He is an archaeologist, like I said. And he gave a 3-hour-long interview. Well, they're clumped together. It was 3 separate interviews, about an hour each. Bottom line, he says there's no evidence for anything in the Book of Mormon or the Bible. He's convinced it's all not historical at all. He says he likes the teachings. But, let's see. I was thinking about making my thoughts just about that. Let's see. There we go, I found it. What I heard, the way I found out about Michael Coe was somebody else brought up this subject in a video, and they pointed out that John Sorenson, who is an archaeologist, apparently at Brigham Young University, maybe he's retired or dead now, I'm not sure how old they are, John Sorenson is. But I'm sure he's not my age. I'm sure he's something higher than my age. Okay, so, John Sorenson listened to the same 3 hours I did, and so I can get 2 birds with 1 stone. This is an open letter. Open letter, of course, means everyone's supposed to read it. And I'm going to read it, and I might inject my thoughts about the 3 hours of Michael Coe's comments. And I guess that's enough of an introduction. Let's do this. Let's see. Dear Mike, some people see a placid stream ahead of them and think the water must be safe to cross, only to find that their depth perception was faulty and deep holes await them. Something like that has happened to you in regard to your podcast with Mr. DeLynn about the Book of Mormon. Before you and other readers repeat the difficulties you encountered, I venture to offer some corrections. Okay, Mormonstories, I gave a brief summary of it. Did I yet? Mormonstories is a podcast series. You can find it on the internet at mormonstories.org. I do not recommend it. I'm not saying, I don't recommend or not recommend. I haven't spent a lot of time watching a lot of the interviews. But they will interview anybody who has even a tiny connection to Mormonism, like a friend is, or they want to give their opinion, or their mother is. Okay, back to the quote, the open letter. About archaeology, quote, these things don't disappear forever, they leave traces. ... If you had iron or steel, you would expect to find these things even if they were all rusted. ... You would find chemical remains. Alright, here's my thoughts. To the best of my knowledge, John Sorenson is dedicated to the Central American location for the Book of Mormon. He firmly believes that. He wrote a book that I did not buy because when I looked into it, it was $60, and I would have paid a few dollars for it to give him his chance to persuade me, but not $60 for you to persuade me of something I didn't agree with. So he's firm. So John Sorenson and I, at the start of this letter, are starting off with different ideas. I used to think it was Central America. So if I talk back to John Sorenson, I'm talking back to old me also. I'm convinced of the Heartland model, that the Lehites landed in Florida, Georgia, around there. That the land of Nephi is Tennessee. That Zarahemla is the place called Zarahemla in the Doctrine and Covenants. That Zarahemla and Bountiful, that line, is the defensive fortifications that have been found connecting two rivers in southern Illinois. And that the Mulekites and the Jaredites were in the Great Lakes region, and that was also a Nephite area because Nephites and Mulekites merged. One weakness in the Central American model, to the best of my knowledge, is a lack of metal implements, when the Nephites clearly had metallurgy. They didn't just have the sword of Laban and didn't make wooden sticks. They had the sword of Laban, which Nephi says he used as a model to make other swords for his people so they could defend themselves. Alright, back to the letter. It is interesting to see your loyalty to the ideals of archaeology, but surely you know that the realities are quite different. The first place where the two collide is in sampling. Probably no more than 200 ancient Mesoamerican sites have been seriously excavated, and those excavations have rarely dug into more than a small portion of the inhabited area of those sites. It would be surprising if as much as 1/10,000th of the information potentially obtainable by studying the material remains so far has been disclosed. Sure, much of the rest would no doubt yield data mainly duplicative of what is already known, but some would not. And a large portion of what has already been excavated has not been studied by contemporary methods or is not accessible for study. So ancient remains of metals may leave traces, but can anybody name a single site where chemical remains have been widely sought by modern methods? I doubt it. An example of the sampling problem is evident in the site of Yutatlan in Guatemala. Fox, Wallace, and Brown reported finding by chance a location just outside the site proper where 200 molds for the manufacture of copper at an industrial level came to light. The facility would have been far larger than what was needed for the city's requirements. What is the chance that such an isolated facility outside the central ceremonial centers where excavation usually goes on would ever be discovered at other places? Then there is the problem of accessing the information that does exist. I have spent considerable time searching site reports for mentions of metal objects that have been found that apparently date before the metal curtain was in quotes, of about 900 AD in Mesoamerica in the area, but are conventionally ignored in discussions by the history of metallurgy. There have proved to be several hundred such specimens dating from about 400 BC to 900 AD, 153 of which were excavated by professional archaeologists. Parentheses, why bother to seek chemical traces of metal when actual specimens are totally ignored? End parentheses. This incidence of metal objects would be even more surprising were it not for the fact that terms have been reconstructed in 5 major Mesoamerican language families that mean metal or metal bell. All the words thought to refer to times prior to 1000 BC. Okay, well, I'm still convinced of the Heartland model. But maybe there was more metal in Central America than I'd realized before. Let's see, but John Sorenson, I think, has good points here. Obviously, excavation archaeology still has a long way to go in reconstructing a complete history of Mesoamerican metallurgy, including both terrestrial and meteoric iron, among more than a dozen known metals and alloys. Eminent metallurgical expert Dudley Easby commented regarding this history. The relative, quote, parentheses, apparent, end parentheses, absence of metals in the early Americas constitutes one of the most infuriatingly enigmatic subjects in the history of technology. The question of the presence of the horse in civilized Mesoamerica further illustrates the problem of what is adequate archaeological sampling and in documentation. C. E. Ray's report of finding horse bones in deep layers of the waterhole at Mayapan, Yucatan, raised an issue that Mercer and Hatt had earlier noted with their finds of horse bones in Yucatan caves. The matter was compounded by Peter Schmidt's 1988 work in Lupton Cave that found horse bones scattered through a number of layers of early pottery bearing debris. He observed, something went on here that is still difficult to explain. Interestingly, he was not aware of Ray's finds. There are also further evidences for pre-1500 AD dates of other horse bones, including 3 radiocarbon date finds from North America. Including North America, that was in parentheses. This, like the metals, is an unfinished archaeological story in the case of defying the dictum that there were no horses for the last 10,000 years in America. Simultaneously, it shows limits of the data revealed by excavations about which so much is said. Another possibility is that some other species was counted as a horse. For example, upon seeing Spanish horses, the Aztecs referred to them as deer that people ride, and there are artistic representations of riders on deer. So what is a horse? Okay, another piece of evidence for horses in North America before the Spanish brought horses is the Spanish did not conquer the Plains Indians, even though they conquered all of South America and all of Central America, because they had horses already before the Spanish came. And the Spanish could not beat them. They were good warriors and they were good horsemen. About the Book of Mormon. This is a quote from Michael Coe. The Jaredites, quote, didn't really survive terribly long, unquote. The Jaredites, quote, go back something like 400-500 BC, end quote. The Jaredites, here's back to Sorenson, the Jaredites left Mesopotamia at the time of the, quote, Great Tower, unquote, presumed to have been around the time of the earliest ziggurat, perhaps a little before 2500 BC. Their demise as a functioning society was after 600 BC. The Nephites were highly civilized people. In origin, yes, except that their small initial party, fewer than 35 men, women, and children, slogged 1,200 miles through the rugged mountains of western Arabia over an 8-year period and subsisted mainly on uncooked meat. This would take most of the civilization out of anyone. When they embarked from the coast of Oman on a voyage of more than 20,000 miles, they took no animals with them and little technology except what knowledge they carried in their heads. Upon landing, Lehi's crew must have been about as decultured as a frazzled band of people could be. Okay, John Sorenson there gives a number for the people. We don't know how many kids they had, but they did have kids. Maybe it was a bigger number than he says here. And about them being uncivilized and having they might have had some livestock with them. They might have domesticated some livestock in Oman or Yemen. Let's see. Quote, they had cattle, they had horses, they had wheat. Quote, maize, by the way, isn't really mentioned in the Book of Mormon, unquote. Okay, those last two were quotes from Michael Coe. John Sorenson writes, see above regarding horses, immediately after landing, quote, probably in coastal Guatemala, end quote. Lehi's people, quote, did find, ... beasts in the forest, quote, parentheses. These animals are all in quotes. Cow, ox, ass, horse, goat, wild goat. Those were all in quotes. 1 Nephi 18:25. At length, some of those creatures ended up domesticated by means and hands not described. Clearly, the animals consisted of Native American species to which newcomers, by a process familiar to groups encountering exotic fauna, applied nearest look-alike names to the newly encountered critters. The first mention of grain cultivation occurred nearly 400 years later. Quote, corn, unquote, parentheses, maize, contrary to your claim, end parentheses, quote, wheat, end quote, and quote, barley, end quote. Corn was the grain of choice. Mosiah 7 verses 22, chapter 9 verses 9. What crop the name, quote, wheat, unquote, wheat was given to is never clarified, but of course it probably would have been some native one, quote, in parentheses. Eventually Mesoamericans cultivated at least 13 species of grain, end quote. Domesticated barley was discovered in archaeological sites in Arizona and in Midwestern states 25 years ago, and it could well have grown in Mexico too. Alright, time out and John Sorenson's thoughts. Here are my thoughts. John Sorenson just proved the heartland, Central North American theory for the Book of Mormon. That's where the barley is. When the Book of Mormon says corn, it might not mean what we mean now, the maize. The Old Testament, King James translation, uses the word corn to describe what Jesus and his apostles dealt with about the year 33. So, corn in the King James Bible, and why not in this Book of Mormon, that is to some degree, largely degree, translated in King James Bible language. Why couldn't corn there just mean any grain? That's what it meant. In the King James Bible, when it says corn, when Jesus' apostles were eating the corn, that did not mean they found modern maize. That meant some kind of grain, and the grains, the edible part of the grain plant. Okay, back to Michael Coe, quote, they had the compass to navigate by, unquote. Not at all. What they had was a device that gave Lehi's original party travel instructions, but it worked by faith, quote, faith, unquote, not on any mechanical, parentheses, quote, compass, unquote, and parentheses, principle. Wow, this is one of the stupidest things I have ever heard people say, is that because God, especially from people who are not atheists, the Book of Mormon says God gave the Liahona to Lehi and hence the rest of the group that was with him. The Liahona was a compass. It told them where to go. I disagree with John Sorenson about not a mechanical principle. God could have made a mechanical device that God controlled. Now, they didn't control it based on mechanics that they controlled. But the compass was something made by God, and as long as you're not an atheist, you should be open to the possibility of God knowing how to make things in the year 600 BC. Next quote from the interview. This is John DeLynn. Quote, there are steel swords mentioned in the Book of Mormon, or shields or helmets or whatever, unquote. Coe, quote, yes, that's correct, unquote. Okay. Here's my thoughts. Steel swords, yes. Helmets are never described. Head plates are described, which have been found in North America. I've seen a video recently that says those are in Central America too. Okay, maybe those are in both places. Shields. I don't remember the Book of Mormon describing which material the shields were made from. Okay, John Sorenson. Lehi's party carried with them on their trek a sword of steel that was preserved as a sacred relic. When Nephites and Lamanites by the thousands were armed with swords, they obviously could not have been of metal, nor is there any reason from the text to suppose that they were. At one point, a large group of Lamanites fled from military service by going to, quote, the place of arms, unquote, to defend themselves. The description of the situation makes it appear to be an obsidian outcrop, possibly El Chayal. Their swords were very probably the obsidian-edged weapons called the Macutwil by the Aztecs. However, at one point in Jaredite history, the record says that they made swords out of steel. This is clearly an unexplained anomaly. Parentheses. However, note the term that is read steel in King James Bible is currently translated by experts as bronze. A variety of shields is known to have been used by Mesoamerican warriors from pre-classical times onward, but helmets are not mentioned at all in the Book of Mormon. Okay, strongly disagree with John Sorenson there. Nephi taught his people how to do metal work. It lists the metals that they had. The Nephites had metal swords. And I'm convinced of the North American model. Here's an evidence for the North American model. Michigan is two peninsulas that stick out into the Great Lakes, or divide a couple of the Great Lakes depending on how you want to look at it, because different Great Lake on either side. And so there's two peninsulas. Why is the Upper Peninsula not a part of Wisconsin? Why did the founders of Michigan want that? Because of the Nephite metal. Because I'm not leftover completed metal from the Nephites, but the ore, the good mines, the good source of metals that the Nephites were using and the Jaredites were using. That was there. Now, I'm not saying the people in Michigan, when they made sure they got the Upper Peninsula 100-something years ago, were thinking, Nephite metal, we want Nephite metal. But they were thinking, we want that copper. Okay, steel. Steel is just iron with a little bit more of other stuff, and not large concentrations. It's very small percentages of other metals that turns iron into steel. So, of course they could have had steel. It's ridiculous to say, no, it wasn't steel. Okay, quote, this is Michael Coe again. Quote, wheeled toys are known in classic times, ... in Veracruz, unquote. John Sorenson, actually these begin at Teotihuacan, at least immediately after the time of Christ, not just in the classic. Michael Coe, quote, let's do the coins. If there were coins, they would be chocolate beans. Why aren't chocolate beans mentioned in the Book of Mormon, unquote. Okay, the Book of Mormon never is explicit and clear about where it is. I am convinced there's a stronger case for where I described, but it's not as clear as I would hope for it. I accept that there's some ambiguity there, some lack of certainty. But some people, like to say, it definitely is Central America. It says it there. It does not. It does not. Nowhere in the Book of Mormon does it say it was Central America. So Michael Coe is reacting to people saying it's Central America. And I was hoping I would like his presentation, because if it's not archaeologically proven where Joseph Smith didn't say it happened, then it helps to make the case for the other place. Disproving the Book of Mormon happening in Central America does not disprove the whole thing. Especially if there's another place it could have happened. Okay, and so Michael Coe is talking as if it says it's in Central America. It does not say that. I'm not sure how if John Sorenson's opinion is it's crystal clear, it's there, it only could have been there, or if John Sorenson is saying he believes it was there, but if he acknowledges some ambiguity. Okay, back to John Sorenson's response. Years ago, the word coinage was gratuitously inserted into the heading of Alma 11 by LDS editors. Here's an important thing to point out. The chapter headings and summaries in the Book of Mormon are not the Book of Mormon that was on the gold plates. The chapter divisions, the verses, those also are not. Those were added by us being some human, now after Joseph Smith translated it into English by the gift and power of God. And so if something was changed in the heading, it doesn't mean we changed the Book of Mormon. It means somebody wrote a summary and somebody later on said, actually it didn't say that, and we took it out. Alright, back to the quote. There is no use of the term coins in the text. The Nephites used, quote, money, unquote. But evidently Nephite money, like that in the Israelite homeland, parentheses, the, quote, shekel, unquote, parentheses, was in weight determined units of some valued substance. Okay, he's right there. The Nephites did not, in their record, call their money coins. They called them money, or they got names for the specific kinds of money. But coin is not in the Book of Mormon. Back to the quote. Cocoa beans were in use, parentheses, however early we do not know, end parentheses, among the Maya, but throughout Mesoamerica, a variety of other materials also served as money. The constant fallback on Maya culture is understandable in the podcast and in terms of your archaeological background, but Nephi culture was not closely congruent with Mayan culture. Alright. Well, I disagree with John Sorenson about where the Book of Mormon took place, but I could be convinced by good evidence or a revelation from God. And a revelation from God would not be one time one person thinks they heard a prophet say something. It would be like changing the name of the choir, like re-emphasizing the true name of the church. Something that all of the apostles sign off on. The prophet will receive a revelation and say, I got a revelation. The whole apostles will agree. We'll have all of them saying it. Kind of like with the Doctrine and Covenants, section 138. The revelation to extend the priesthood to all men regardless of race, and temple blessings to all men, all women regardless of race. Changing the, let's see, so that's yeah, so that's enough about that. Revelation. But here's a brief summary of the time periods we're talking about. The Nephites, the Lehites, left Jerusalem about 600 BC. They eventually came to the New World. It took them a few years. So between 6 and 500 you have the beginning of that civilization. The Jaredites left around 2500, the Tower of Babel, to the Americas. Here's one weakness in the Central American theory. The Central American theory for the Book of Mormon has them living right on top of each other, like one mountain over, and nobody went exploring for hundreds of years. It took, yeah, let's see, well actually the Mulekites took over Jaredite lands after the Jaredites killed themselves off, and only the king survived to see the prophecy fulfilled. And these these Mulekites in the Jaredite lands, in the Central American model of the Book of Mormon, were right next to the Nephites. Not literally this far, but a day's walk, or something really close. They were a hump over one mountain, something really close. A lot closer than the Heartland model has them being. Alright, so the Jaredites 2500, they kill themselves off. The Nephite culture and civilization died in that last final battle, 400 AD, except for Moroni, who went on to bury the Book of Mormon, and Moroni does not know about any survivors. It's possible maybe there was somebody that went into hiding. Moroni does note that Nephites could save their life by denying the Christ. In other words, denouncing Christianity, which would mean the death of the culture, because that was an important part of the culture. Unfortunately, they were misusing their Christianity, and so that's why we're not really being good Christians, and that's why God had to let them be killed off. So if the Mayan civilization doesn't go back to before 400, then we should not expect to find perfect matches between Mayan civilization and Nephite civilization. So John Sorenson had a good point there. Quote, silk, nothing, end quote. John Sorenson, the Spaniards described at least 5 Mesoamerican varieties of what they term silk or its equivalent. None of them use a species of silkworm that prevailed in East Asia. Alright, sometimes animals go extinct and they don't leave a trace. I'm not sure if there's ever been a dodo bird fossil found, but we know they exist because of the humans that killed them off talking about them. So there might be some form of silk that just stopped being made. The insect that made the silk might have died out a few hundred years ago. And silk could just mean any fine, high-quality fabric. Let's see. 70 calendar was unknown in Mesoamerica. That was Michael Coe. John Sorenson. Helen Newswander agreed with Eric Thompson that there was a 7-day week feature, one based on a logical division, 1/4 of a 28-day lunar month. In any case, the 3 mentions in the Book of Mormon of week do not say that the period was 7 days. Quote, weeks, unquotes, or of other lengths are known in various cultures around the world. Quote, chariots, question mark. They, parentheses, Mesoamericans, parentheses, never had chariots, end quote. Alright, that was Michael Coe. Here's John Sorenson. This may be correct. The meaning of chariots mentioned in the Book of Mormon text remains mysterious. They are mentioned only on 2 occasions in very limited geographical areas in connection with horses. And by the way, no chariot has ever been excavated in Palestine, despite documentary statements implying that they were very numerous. Okay, John Sorenson had a good point there, I think. But there are chariots in North America. Chariot carvings and horses. So we've got the chariots where the Book of Mormon took place. But he does point out here that in Palestine we know from documentary evidence, writings, that there were chariots, but we don't have archaeological evidence. Archaeology has a weakness, and it's things rot. Dan, how do you know what people ate? It turns into poop. You can't be certain about some things. Some things rot. Some things might be destroyed, and an invading army, a conquering army, might burn up the most treasured things of the people they conquered, and then you don't have it to know what the conquered people were doing. Okay, back to Michael Coe. Quote, pig.0, let's see. Not one pig bone has ever shown up in pre-Columbian excavations. Period, quote, end quote. Alright, John Sorenson's response to that. Oh, come now. Peccaries were hunted, kept, and even herded, and they surely are pigs. Yes, in fact, the Nebraska man tooth, which never was a man's tooth, despite evolutionists claiming they'd found the half-man, half-ape, and drawing pictures of him and his wife, and on one tooth, knowing how furry he was, how hairy he was, how he lived. That tooth's been called a pig tooth and a peccary tooth, depending on who's talking about it. So there were those pigs there. Alright, Michael Coe. Quote, elephants, there's nothing. Absolutely zero. End quote. Beginning quote. The Clovis people, about, 10,000 BC, killed them all, end quote. John Sorenson. This is a good instance of converting Paul Martin's hypothesis into fact without checking the data. Mastodon remains have been dated by radiocarbon around 500 BC in Florida, around the Great Lakes region to 4000 BC, and in the Mississippi Valley to near 3300 BC, perhaps to near 100 BC near St. Petersburg, Florida, parentheses, quote, low terminal, parentheses, C14, and parentheses, dates for the Mastodon indicate lingering survival in isolated areas, end quote, and parentheses, and at sites in Alaska and Utah dating around 5000 BC. In the Book of Mormon, mention of elephants occurs in a single verse in the Jaredite account, and he quotes it, dated in the 3rd millennium BC, after which a record is silent. Alright. I think John Sorenson could have made an even stronger point by just pointing out radiocarbon dating is okay, but not perfect. But older things probably... One weakness in radiocarbon dating is you need the radiocarbon. You need C14. What if there was none at the beginning of this earth, the beginning of creation? And what if that's why people lived so long? Until Noah's flood, people lived longer than they do now. What if the atmosphere was different? It had no radioactive carbon because of something in the atmosphere that blocked the light rays, the wavelengths, that turn the nitrogen into radioactive carbon. They'll turn the carbon into radioactive carbon. Now, if that's the case, if there would start out with no carbon, it would need to be building up, and I've heard of studies that show we are not at equilibrium yet. We are not at a balanced amount where we're gaining and losing the same amount. You're going to have an older bad date from something back then if we had less carbon in the atmosphere. So these dates could be inaccurate, and they could be Jaredite 2000 elephants there, 2000 BC. Alright, quote, every time, this Michael Coe, every time you look at the illustrations in the popular edition of the Book of Mormon, you see that's a Maya city, end quote. John Sorenson. What do popular illustrations have to do with actual history? And even then, how would you know what the illustrator had in mind a Maya city instead of merely a Mesoamerican city? There's too much gratuitous Mayanization going on throughout this entire discussion. The text Nephites were not Maya in all probability. The Lamanites may have been in part. Yep, good refutation. Alright, quote, there are no King Benjamins or anybody like that in Maya literature, end quote. Fallacious thinking, would you say? There are no Jesus Christ or anybody like that in Roman, parentheses, or Greek, Egyptian, Syrian, Jewish, etc., end parentheses. Monuments or literature, would you expect there to be? This has no relevance to the question of whether there was a Jesus Christ. Furthermore, history was often rewritten by successors. As Nigel Davis noted, I am more than ever convinced that codices were destroyed at intervals, and history was then rewritten to suit the ruler of the day. Yep, good point. Alright, and there's a weakness in archaeology, or something that it can't answer, and things do get destroyed, so yeah, there could have been people that their records did not survive. Let's see. Michael Coe, when, quote, we start getting extensive Maya inscriptions, ... they don't mention any of these wonderful people out of the Book of Mormon, nothing, end quote. John Sorenson, see the point immediately above, but how do you know the Nephites were not mentioned? Quote, mention, end quote, is a matter of using a name or ethnic label, but what name would, quote, the Maya, quote, use if they had referred to the Nephites? Surely not the English translation, Nephites. Of course, we do not know the native name in any language that the Nephites bore. Let's see. Michael Coe. there's no writing for the Olmec, quote, which is peculiar if these people came from the Middle East, end quote. Not quite. The Kasajal block is joined by the tread-upon figure at San Jose Mogote, and the item reported by Rust et al. From near San Lorenzo. All are dated to the Olmec era. Mike, 2006. In 2006, you co-authored a paper on the Kaskajal block in Science, describing it as the oldest writing in the New World. Your discussion and description seemed confused because you tell Dellin that this block contains Olmec writing, dating about 900 to 800 BC, immediately after claiming there is no writing for the Olmec, none, zero. Moreover, Fred Peterson found a cylinder seal at Tlatelolco that was reported on by Dave Kelly, and that both he and John Graham at Berkeley believe to bear writing. That seal has been dated at Oxford by thermoluminescence at 2,000 to 3,200 years ago, coming from Tlatelolco and dating so. It has to be Olmec. Parentheses. It has tentatively been connected stylistically to cylinder seals in Iran of the 3rd millennium by a Near East seals expert who was not told of its Mexican provenience. And parentheses. Okay. Population. Quote, the Aztecs could field fairly good-sized armies, but never this size. Parentheses, hundreds of thousands, and parentheses. The following facts are documented. The Quiche force opposing the Spaniards numbered 232,000. Despite the fact that some groups abstained from the alliance, the Aztecs mustered a force of 400,000 in a fairly routine campaign against a nearby kingdom. More problematic is Alba Ixtliquotli's account of Central Mexican history, according to which a combined Aztec army at one point consisted of 700,000 men. Of the hazier past, a historian said that in the last war of the Toltecs, which lasted 3 years and 2 months, a total, parentheses, including women and parentheses, of 5,600,000 persons were slain. Even if we skeptically and arbitrarily reduce that figure by 90%, the number would be of the same order of magnitude as that reported in the Book of Mormon for the final battle at Cumorah. Good response. One other thing to point out. When we had that final battle, they got everyone involved, and the civilization literally died because almost everyone died, and anyone that didn't save themselves by deconverting away from Christianity. They denounced the Christ, or renounced the Christ. Michael Coe, quote, there are no Semitic words, however, whatsoever in it meaning Mayan language. It's got no relation whatsoever with any languages that we know of in the Old World, end quote. Alright. No archaeologist is qualified to speak in these absolute terms on this abstruse subject. Brian Stubbs, a leading scholar on the Uto-Aztecian language family, has shown that languages of that group show major similarities with Hebrew and Egyptians. He concludes that the Uto-Aztecian family developed as a Creole tongue formed from Hebrew, Egyptian, and a native ancestral language of Central Mexico that then divided multiple times. Some, but not all, other Mesoamerican tongues show similar characteristics. Meanwhile, a number of other Native American languages have been shown to be connected to Old World sources, few of which had been suspected. Morris Swadesh was among other linguists who feel that it is perfectly possible that a group of people, having arrived speaking a new language, in the New World of course, was absorbed into an already existing linguistic community. The phenomenon he describes would be like what took place with native Toltecs who migrated into Guatemala, where they came to dominate local populations. Linguistic patterns of highland Guatemalans suggest that Toltec influence involved no mass migration of Nahu speakers to the highlands. Only small numbers of the Toltecs must have come in contact with a well-established indigenous population, the invader's tongue being absorbed within the linguistic milieu of the more numerous and indigenous population. After only about 500 years, Robert Carmack found very little linguistic or cultural, let alone archaeological evidence for their presence. There, as their history in the Popol Vuh reported, yet today no Mesoamericanist scholar considers Popol Vuh anything but a fundamental source of the pre-native Spanish culture. The Book of Mormon is in the same situation. Okay. Yeah, well, I wouldn't have made the same argument to counter that weak argument from Michael Coe that John Sorenson did. Languages changed dramatically. French, English, German, they all have a common language ancestor. Farsi, but, you know, a lot of us can't talk to each other now without learning the other language. Languages change, and so there could be big changes that we don't have well documented because paper rots, which is why we don't need to have Olmec writing to prove that we don't need to have Olmec writing to prove or believe that there could be people there, because paper rots. So it is unreasonable to demand Olmec writing when paper rots. And things that don't rot would likely have been melted down by people who did not care about history. Alright, and so, but the word for God in the, I think it's Algonquin, is Jehovah. Hey, there's a linguistic match there. And the Bat Creek Stone, that's Hebrew writing. There is Hebrew writing where the Book of Mormon took place. So maybe we don't have Hebrew connections in Central America. Let's see. About Joseph Smith. Delenn said, quote, Joseph Smith himself, you know, would walk around and see a pile of bones and say, that was the famous Nephite warrior Zelph, or whatever. He would see a city and say, this was the ancient city of blah, blah, blah. End quote. Parentheses. Not contradicted by Coe, end parentheses. Okay, so that's not what Coe said, but he could have said, that's not true, don't know about that, but he didn't, you know, stop that. This statement is vastly overblown in terms of Smith's real history. He made no such practice. Wow. Yeah, he did. Alright, one of the good evidences for the Book of Mormon took place is what Joseph Smith said about it. He did make statements about it being where he was. And part of it in New York. God ordered him, commanded Joseph Smith to send missionaries to the Lamanites. He sent them to southern Canada, Missouri, and Ohio. Nothing even as far south as the southern states. And God did not scold Joseph Smith for sending them to the wrong place. But God did scold Joseph Smith sometimes. So if God didn't scold Joseph Smith about that, and he scolded Joseph Smith about other things, that's a really good clue that that's where the Lamanites and Nephites lived, and those were Lamanite, Nephite people. Not the Nephite culture, but maybe ancestors of the Nephites who denounced the Christ to save their life at 400 AD. So that's a really good clue. And Zion's March, really quick summary of Zion's March. We were being mistreated in Missouri. Our property was being stolen. At the time Joseph Smith was in Ohio, Joseph Smith got about 600 people and marched all the way to Missouri. On that march, he identified by revelation bones as Lamanite and Nephite, and he wrote to his wife home and said they were walking over the plains of the Nephites. So Michael Coe is actually more correct about this. Michael Coe and John Delenn are more correct about what Joseph Smith said and did than John Sorenson. Although there aren't that many cities that I remember reading reliable quotes from Joseph Smith about him identifying. I think the dark print is Michael Coe. Michael Coe. Joseph Smith, quote, claimed that the Book of Abraham, was in Reformed Egyptian and that he could read it, end quote. Alright, one reason I really wanted to make the video to denounce Michael Coe for this bad information. I was hoping he had some integrity. Maybe he does have some. But this statement shows that he did not try to find out at all or understand. It would not have taken a long time to find out that Joseph Smith never claimed himself to be a linguistic expert that translated things on his own power and mind. He got a hold of the papyrus. We do not have all of it. We have a very small amount of it. That came from Egypt, and bought some mummies too. And he knew he could read it because of the gift and power of God. Not because it was Reformed Egyptian. He never identified it as Reformed Egyptian. The Nephites used Reformed Egyptian because their ancestors hadn't been near to Egypt for 1,000 years. And so they were honest and knew they probably tweaked some things. Because languages do evolve. But Joseph Smith never said the Book of Abraham was, written in Reformed Egyptian, and he did not translate it by that. The Book of Mormon, the Book of Abraham, is true. It is a wonderful book. Y'all should read it. Everyone should read it. But it was not translated because of Joseph Smith's own human powers. It was translated by the gift and power of God. Alrighty. Quote, Michael Coe. Joseph Smith, quote, sees the people, incredible people like the Comanche and the Sioux and the Cheyenne and people like that, quote, quote, ... that probably would have influenced him a lot. He had to have horses. End quote. Patently impossible. Nothing was known of the eastern United States about horse-using Plains Indians in Joseph's day. In, the 1820s. In any case, the Book of Mormon never suggests that horses were ridden by anybody. Okay, the Book of Mormon teaches us, the most important thing it does is teach us about Jesus Christ, not the animals they use. But it does mention him, and it's accurate completely in all historical details it mentions. It does mention horses, and it does explicitly talk about chariots, and it does say that the horses were useful for the Jaredites. It lists what the Jaredites had for food and for use of animals. And it lists the horses as useful for people to use, not to eat. How do you use a horse if you're not riding it? Pulling stuff, I guess you could, but why would they not ride them? They probably rode them. But John Sorenson has a good point there about the weakness of Michael Coe's argument. Joseph Smith, the Plains Indian culture was little known probably to extremely poor, indigent farm workers in New York State. About Book of Mormon archaeology and the New World NWAF. On the New World Archaeological Foundation, quote, they really never found plates of gold or wheels or steel swords or anything of the sort. ... Constantly arriving there in early days were slight screwballs out of Salt Lake and places like that, coming down with metal detectors. ... Running around trying to find plates of gold and whatnot. John Sorenson. This must be based on gossip or rumor at best. The NWAF's history yields nothing that suggests such an objective was held or that such weird visits ever took place, nor do surviving personnel know of anything like that. Even without hearing reading John Sorenson's counter to that claim, what's wrong with having a metal detector and using all the possible tools to try to understand the past when you're at an archaeological dig site? In fact, to not bring a metal detector if they are accessible would be unscientific, would be pre-deciding what you're going to find instead of just seeing what you find. John Robertson, a fantastically good linguist, said Michael Coe. John Sorenson, perhaps of interest, after Robertson retired from the BYU faculty, he and his wife served an LDS mission, during which, among other things, they averred the authenticity of the Book of Mormon. Okay. And let's get at least this point in. This is going to be a two-parter. Quote, land bridge into Asia. This is something Book of Mormon archaeologists don't really like to talk about, end quote. John Sorenson. Why this statement was made is a